Tonight, you arrive in snow-quiet Salem in the winter of 1693, a Boston minister riding north to reconcile testimonies and church records after the trials have fallen silent. If you enjoy this gentle journey, please consider subscribing. Now take a deep breath, get comfortable, and let's begin our journey into a timbered home and a cold meeting house, where parchment, hearth smoke, and careful doubt guide you toward a quieter truth. The ride north from Boston in late winter lays a quiet mantle over you, as if the road itself counsels restraint. Hoofbeats thud into frozen ruts, steady and muffled, while your horse's breath rises in pale threads that vanish into the grey Atlantic light. Low stone walls run beside you in long, patient lines, their stacked field stones frosted with wind-blown snow, and beyond them the orchards stand leafless, limbs inked against a steel sky. Here and there you pass a pasture gate hung with a drift, or a cart track glazed into a ribbon of ice where wheels ground through slush weeks ago. The light is flat but serviceable, lending the land a sober cast that suits your errand. A pair of crows lift from a hedgerow and settle again downstream of the wind, and the air carries a faint salt damp from the coast that pricks your knuckles and settles into your sleeves. You ride with your cloak tight at your throat and your thoughts arranged like papers in a bundle, orderly for now. Salem village comes to you as a hush more than a boundary, the settlement rising almost imperceptibly from pasture and woodlot. Thin plumes of smoke rise straight from chimneys, without flourish, and doors sit closed against the weather, keeping heat and talk within. Paths creak where feet have packed snow into a crust, and a single sled runner squeals as someone drags firewood to a shed. A woman crosses a yard with a pail, skirts lifted from the slush, and the meeting house shows its plain angles at the center, timbered and without ornament beyond conviction. Months have passed since the height of the accusations. The special court of Oyer and Terminer that sat in the summer of 1692 was dissolved by Governor William Phips before the year's end, and the newly appointed Superior Court, sitting in early 1693, has begun to acquit many who remained jailed. Executions had ceased months before you set out, and the community has drawn inward to mend itself by ordinary means rather than proclamation. You feel no sudden change in the air at the boundary stone, only a town that works quietly at the business of continuing. The Deacon's house receives you with timber and warmth, its frame of hewn beams darkened by years of smoke and handling. Wide floorboards answer your step with a dry murmur, and the great hearth at the center throws a steady, workable heat that reaches to your knees, but not yet to your shoulders. Hearth smoke lifts into the rafters and softens there, mingled with the clean, waxy scent of tallow candles, whose flames tremble when the latch lifts and drops. From pegs along a beam hang bunches of dried sage and thyme and a braid of onions. In a corner, a basket of stored apples breathes a faint sweetness touched by cellar air. A pewter plate catches lamplight and returns it in a low sheen that seems to pool and gather rather than glitter, a kindly light that does not startle tired eyes. You shake off your cloak and feel the sting of thaw creep into your fingers, while the deacon's wife sets a small mug of small beer near the settle. Mild, safe, and customary at table when water runs doubtful in pipes and barrels. Sleet begins to tick on the shutters as afternoon leans toward evening, a sound like sand sifted from a hand. Supper is austere and steady after the road, each dish answering hunger without ceremony. Salt cod soaked and then warmed to tenderness, flakes cleanly beneath your spoon, and parsnips lend a gentle sweetness that sits well with the sea on your tongue. The bread is coarse from a mix of rye and Indian corn, a familiar winter loaf, and a thin gloss of molasses darkens its face and sticks kindly to your fingers. The Indian pudding that follows has been set to bake since before you arrived. Cornmeal, milk, and a trace of nutmeg slow cooked into a softness that warms from within. The spice is precious and thus used sparingly, its fragrance a hint rather than a flourish. You drink the small beer and feel in it the mild grain and a faint warmth, the sort kept by households for safety and thrift, as much food as drink. Talk does not press. Weather is noted, and the condition of fences where posts heave from the frost, and whether the cow will calve early. At the table's end, the deacon's voice carries an evening petition, asking the Almighty to grant quiet years and neighbors made peaceable again, with no names spoken and no heat to the words. Your chamber shows the plain means of the place and time, sufficient without excess. A Bible rests on a three-legged stool by the bed, its leather darkened by handling, and beside it a pewter basin and ewer stand ready for washing, the rim of the basin polished by years of careful use. The blanket on the bed is homespun and weighty, smelling faintly of clean wool and the hearth's ghost smoke. When you lay your palm upon it, the cloth feels honest and strong. A single candle burns on a small board, its flame tilting when the draught slips around the shutter's edge, a reminder that glazed panes are dear and shutters do the weather work. Sleet ticks and taps on the boards, sometimes steady, sometimes a scatter against the grain, while somewhere below a stair gives a tired creak as someone crosses from hearth to door. Lamplight from the hall makes a soft oval on the pewter rim before it fades. The light does not reach the corners, and the corners require no light tonight. You draw off your boots and feel the cold you have carried settle out of your bones, not leaving entirely, but becoming something you can bear without thought. Your purpose, like the small candle, is modest but steady, and you set it before yourself again, now that the road lies behind you. By day you will sort and label what the magistrates and clerks have gathered, depositions taken at kitchen tables, warrants penned in haste, testimonies crowded with scripture, and the scattered bills and receipts of a court that had to be built while it was being used. Twine will bind each packet, and a neat hand will fix headings so they may be found again in Boston without rummaging, as befits a colonial archive meant to outlast mere recollection. Yet you mean to read more than words if grace allows, the patterns that gave them shape, the habits of speech that travel from one mouth to another, the ordinary pressures that leave their own kind of ink. Around you, the village resumes its tasks in the muted way of late winter, mending rails lifted by frost, feeding animals from dwindling stores, spinning flax into thread by the hearth, work that depends on rhythm rather than fervor. Memory is present, but muted, like a brook running under ice. It speaks quietly and does not insist on being answered at once. You lie down with these thoughts not to fan them, but to keep them near and orderly, prepared for the unhurried observation the morrow will ask of you. Each morning you step out into a pale day that has not yet decided to brighten, and the path to the meeting-house answers with a dry, creaking sound beneath your boots. Snow crusts the common and lies in low waves against the fence rails, while bare maples lift a filigree of twigs that scratch at the washed sky as the wind moves through. Your cloak rises and falls like a slow breath, the wool taking on fine needles of sleet that melt without hurry at your collar. A cartwheel, tipped against a wall, holds a soft rim of ice. A dog trots across the lane and leaves a dotted script that the wind soon edits. From the direction of Salem village, which is in this winter still a part of Salem and not the later Danvers, you hear a far rattle of shutters. And from Salem town the slower chime of a smith's hammer drifting over the fields of Essex County. By the time you reach the meeting-house door, your fingertips sting with cold, and the air has the faint metal taste that comes when snow begins again. The meeting-house greets you with a hush that holds its own kind of company, and the small brazier by the far table wakes to a dull glow when you stir its coals. Tables stand scarred by years of elbows and ledgers, their surfaces darkened where hands have rubbed the grain smooth, and along them lie bundles of parchment and paper tied with twine or ribbon. Iron gall ink has browned on many pages toward a soft sepia, its acidity leaving a feathery halo in the fibers, while wafer seals cling like thin wafers of bread to folded orders, and red wax, resinous and faintly sweet, caps others with droplets that have cooled into spilled beads. Here and there margins are speckled with a sprinkling of sand used to dry fresh writing, a grit you can feel when your fingertip passes over a canted line, and a small wooden shaker sits ready to apply more. A clerk's practised hand meets you again and again in the headings, curled capitals announcing warrant, examination, or deposition, set in a formula that keeps the page obedient to expectation. The room smells of warming iron and parchment, a thin smoke from the brazier nipping the corner of your eyes, and the window panes tick softly when sleet returns, as if the winter were politely asking to be remembered. The documents you handle form a narrow life of their own, one that runs from a constable's knock to the jailer's bill. You read arrest warrants directing officers to take a named suspect into custody, examinations that capture questions put by magistrates and the answers given, and depositions from the afflicted setting out their pains and accusations. In the same stacks lie depositions from neighbors, men and women whose testimony ranges from the ordinary measure of character to incidents that they now recall with sharpened edges, along with indictments phrased in legal formula against the peace of their majesties, Elizabeth written as Eliza and Mary as Ma. Receipts detail fees for chains, for straw, for the keeping of prisoners at a daily rate that tallies like any other account, and the neat sums add a cool arithmetic to what the narratives warm. You remind yourself of the immediate context. In 1692, the court of Oyer and Terminer sat to hear these cases and relied heavily on spectral evidence, visions and afflictions said to be caused by the accused, while prominent ministers, among them Increase Mather, cautioned that such testimony should not, by itself, suffice. Now, in this winter of 1693, the papers you sought come from both before and after that caution, and the headings and dates help you keep the change in view without stopping to judge it. As you begin to read in order rather than by the handful, you notice the return of certain words with an almost musical regularity, and you mark the recurrence without haste. Afflictions are described as pinching and choking, A spectre is said to sit upon the chest, or to appear as the shape of a small creature, a cat or a bird, or a familiar that nips and pricks, and always the pain comes sudden and sore. The cadence repeats so closely in some testimonies that you follow it backward, through Salem village to Salem town, through Essex County into neighbouring places like Andover and Topsfield noted on the docket corner. And there you find an early deposition whose phrasing seems to radiate into the later record. You consider quiet routes by which such wording travels, thinking of a crowded day in the Meetinghouse when examinations draw an audience, and the same turns of speech are heard by many. You picture winter visits when neighbours pass from hearth to hearth and retell events by lamplight, the sentences keeping their shape like a well-worn prayer. You also consider the habits of the record itself. A clerk who knows the expected form may pre-fill lines from a known template, and a magistrate, accustomed to an established sequence, may ask questions that invite answers already half-articulated. When the grit of sand whispers over a fresh deposition, you lift the page and feel its weight, and the repetition, once seen, feels less like a marvel and more like the ordinary way that language moves in a tight-knit place. Your body keeps its own calendar of the labour, and you register it alongside the headings and dates. The brazier warms your shins but not your fingers, so you pause often to press your knuckles to the heat, then return to knotting twine around a sheaf whose edges have softened from damp. Red wax leaves a faint scent on your gloves when you handle folded orders sealed against prying, and the parchment gives off a slightly animal tang that is different from the rag paper's cleaner note. Smoke stings the eyes in a thin, persuasive line that fades only when you blink and look away to the window, where sleet annotates the glass with a steady, patient tick. Between stacks, you straighten labels so that names and dates remain legible. Salem Village, Salem Town, Andover, Ipswich, each aligned under the county of Essex, and beside them you add a clearer note that the village, which later generations will call Danvers, is at this time still a part of Salem. When you reach for the sand shaker to fix a new entry, grains catch briefly on your skin, and the small rasp grounds you in the simple mechanics of ink and drying. In the afternoons you sort and bundle for the governor's archive, letting the discipline of order lead your hands while your thoughts remain as even as the light. Names are tied with names, and dates follow dates. Shire distinctions are set out in a steady hand. Essex above Suffolk, Middlesex apart, because the political body asks for a map just as the spiritual body does. Here a set of indictments lacks a final attestation, perhaps mislaid when the court of Oyer and Terminer was dissolved, and there a deposition is blurred at the bottom edge where damp has lifted the ink into a brown mist. You note the imperfections without drama, so that a later reader will not search for what is missing. Some packets bear the faint mark of rain, a translucent tide line across a corner, and others carry a clerk's marginal initials that are not repeated elsewhere. You copy them as they appear, and do not attempt to make them agree. Read, not, sort, breathe. The rhythm steadies you until the work itself is a kind of stillness, the room holding together in its quiet, while the wind strokes the panes with soft insistence. By the time you rise to leave, your eyes remember the small loops and long tails of a practiced hand, and you carry with you the texture of this evidence, words that have passed through many mouths and many pens, made tangible by ink, sand, twine, and the winter air. Evenings by the Deacon's hearth turn from talk to the small economies of keeping a household, and you watch as work steadies the room. The Deacon's wife skims the simmering pot with a wooden ladle, setting aside the clear fat in a glazed bowl to cool, a store of drippings that will later slick a pan for frying cakes or lend body to a pottage. An older child draws a paring knife along a tallow candle, shaving a pale curl to rub on stiff boot leather and along a strip of linen thread, so the stitch will pull true and not fray as she mends a torn cuff. A pot of boiled mutton and turnips gives off its plain, sustaining perfume. When the lid lifts, steam beads on the beam above and then disappears. Cups of small beer are set within reach as a matter of habit, a mild table drink that belongs to mealtime as surely as the bread and trencher, and no one remarks on it. Conversation, when it comes, is careful. Mention of some family names causes eyes to lower, and the clatter of spoons to fill the pause, and someone asks instead about the road to Marblehead, or the hay stored in the barn. You mark these turnings as you would the shift of wind, not to judge them, but to learn the weather in which words now must travel. Winterfare explains some of the reticence, for the season teaches thrift and the counting of what remains. Preserved fish and salted meats come to the table in established turns, their saltiness tamed by boiling or by pairing with parsnips, carrots, and turnips taken from the root cellar where they sleep under sand. Dried peas break down into a hearty pottage that can be stretched with a bone, and smoked herring or salt cod reappear in cakes bound with meal and fried in those saved drippings. Indian corn, ground coarse, is the grain that abides when wheat is too dear. You taste it in the rye and Indian loaves, where cornmeal lends weight and keeps the crumb from crumbling, and in puddings where the meal is stirred slowly into milk and molasses until it thickens and sets. At the hearth they speak of the rhythm of baking days, and the way a Johnny cake takes the iron if the batter is spread thin and the pan is well greased, practical judgments that make up the substance of a winter week. Along the road and in the galleries of the Meetinghouse, by contrast, words idle and then fall away, and when they do return, they come edged with caution. The town is teaching itself new manners for the keeping of peace. Sabbath brings a different cadence, one that is steady rather than quiet, and you join your hosts in taking it up. The family draws learnedly from the Bay Psalm book, the lines plain and close to their Hebrew root, and the deacon's voice lines out each phrase so that the youngest can follow. The congregation's old practice now kept within a single room. Metrical verses move at an even pace through long measure and common measure, and the tune, familiar in its simplicity, asks for no flourish beyond breath and steady pitch. A chapter is read without embellishment, then a prayer offered in the household manner, naming both thanks and needs in a moderate voice, asking for a quiet year and strength for the slow labor of reconciliation. You notice at meeting later that the galleries, once the theatre of whisper and rumour, now offer little beyond the creak of boards and an occasional cough. Even the walk home keeps to weather, fodder, and the price of nails. This is not a silencing imposed from without so much as a thinning of appetite for certain narratives. The mouths that carried them last year seem reluctant to bear them again. You write the metered lines in memory with their plain rhymes, thinking how the parish holds itself together partly by shared measures and partly by what it declines to sing. Your visit to Reverend Nicholas Noyes takes place in this register of measured speech, and his parsonage embodies it. In his study an hourglass sits within easy reach of the sermon desk, its sand used to discipline both talk and time, and nearby lie manuscripts sewn into neat gatherings, margins pricked with chapter and verse, the texts stitched with scripture in both senses. On the shelf you see English divinity, Baxter and Perkins, Ames and Sibby's, well thumbed, their arguments familiar companions to a ministry long practiced. He gives you boiled mutton with turnips and a mug of small beer, and takes his portion without ceremony. Then speaks of the trials in the tone of settled conviction, that witchcraft was and remains a real and present danger to any godly town. You listen as one minister to another, neither inviting nor withholding contradiction, and when he pauses, you offer context rather than contest. That Increase Mather's cases of conscience cautioned against spectral evidence, that Cotton Mather's involvement is much debated, with some hearing in his writings both warning and encouragement, that Governor Phipps dissolved the court of Oyer and Termina, and has since forbidden further reliance on spectral testimony. Noyes hears you, nods once, and returns to the principle that authority must act when confessions and afflictions appear to agree. He does not recant, and you do not press him to. In the village you have already learned that some jurors and accusers will in time express remorse, yet in this year many keep their counsel, unsure of what to own and what to set aside, and his reserve belongs to that wider weather. When you come back to the Deacon's house at dusk, the household has resumed its unremarkable saving and setting by, a work that steadies the mind after any heavy subject. The older child slides a scrap of cloth under the pinched place in a cap, and draws the needle through with the tallow-smoothed thread, and the deacon's wife pours the congealed mutton fat into a small stone pot, to be kept cool against the next baking day. Supper is thin but warm, with a slice of rye and Indian bread spread with molasses, preserved fish flaked into a stew, and a small pudding made from cornmeal thickened over the embers. Small beer fills the gaps the food cannot, and lends a friendly bitterness. When a neighbor calls at the door for a borrowed hoe or to ask after a child's cough, the conversation keeps to such errands and never strays into old troubles. You note how the neighbor's eyes slide from the family Bible on its shelf, and how his voice lowers at the mention of Meetinghouse news. The household retires early, the stairs creaking under familiar feet, and the fire is banked with a practiced hand so that coals will survive till morning. The quiet that follows is not the hush of fear, but the sound that work makes when it rests, a stillness weighted with ordinary plans. By dim candle in your guest chamber, you set these observations to paper before sleep, and let the ink dry in the draught from the casement. You note the particular movements of talk, the way a subject is set down and another lifted, like tools changed in the hand, the way a psalm's meter carries a family through a winter hour without waste, the way fat saved from one meal becomes the next day's provision. You write that Indian corn fills the belly where wheat will not, and that its meal, stirred long with milk and molasses, renders a pudding smoother than its humble materials suggest. You add that rye and Indian bread keeps well in the cold, and welcomes drippings as a kindness. You remind yourself that small beer belongs to every table here, not as indulgence, but as custom, and that the parish's reading runs from the Bay Psalm book at home to Baxter and Perkins in the parsonage, a range that frames the town's conscience. You record, too, that in counsel with Reverend Noyes you heard a careful defence of the proceedings, and that when you brought forth the warnings of Increase Mather and the governor's interdict against spectral evidence, they were taken as matters to weigh, not as commands to feel. Finally, you observe that jurors and accusers may later speak with sorrow, yet at present the earth is still frozen and most mouths are closed. This, too, is data for the archive. You sand the page, fold it, and lay it with the other notes, a ledger of temper, food, and phrasing that will help you reckon how belief moves among neighbors when the air has begun to clear. You return to the meeting-house with a more searching mind, and the day seems made for it, white and still, with a damp cold that climbs the sleeves. The small brazier gives off a dull glow that scarcely warms your hands, and the scent of thawing wool rises from your cloak as melted flakes darken the floorboards. Parchment is stacked in uneven towers, their edges stiff with old wet, their surfaces scratched by quills that hurried through hearings and long evenings. As you lay out another bundle and loosen its twine, the fibers whisper and tighten again when you rebind a finished stack, a small sound that marks your progress better than any clock. Now the repetitions in the testimonies catch the eye like a warp in the vellum, phrases that move from one page to the next, the same turns of speech blooming in many mouths, as if a single vine had climbed all the walls. You note how a complaint of pinching in one deposition is echoed by pinched sorely in another, how the shape of an accused person is said to afflict in one town, and days later afflict in another with the same verbs, as though the words themselves are travelling faster than the riders who carry them. You sit with these pages in quiet, and the room's silence makes the echoes more distinct, so that the language rather than the ink seems to be what links them. You begin to see the mechanics of it, not as malice but as process, the way official speech gathers and settles. The clerk, pressed by cold and the magistrate's pace, writes swiftly and regularizes spellings without remark, and in so doing he smooths different voices into a common form, which later readers, like you, might mistake for a single conviction. The magistrate, skilled in examination, repeats his questions in the same order from one session to the next. What have you seen? What did it say? Whom did it resemble? So that the replies naturally fit those grooves. The witnesses, pious and fearful, bring scripture to bear, and you can almost hear the cadence of familiar verses rising in the room. Resist the devil, and he will flee. Be sober, be vigilant, until doctrine and testimony overlap and reinforce each other. You note, too, how allegations of spectral harm appear, visions in which a battered neighbor sees the likeness of an accused tormenting her, taken by some in the previous court as evidence of an invisible assault. You write a clarifying margin note to yourself. Such claims were once admitted by the court of Oyer and Termina, though many doubted them. They are now received with greater caution, for visions may tell truth or fancy, and the line is thin in a season of fear. Your pen lifts, and you remember that the world your neighbors inhabit is one in which invisible realities are not only acknowledged but expected, where providence and temptation press upon daily life as tangibly as frost upon a window pane. You understand, too, how language circulates beyond the bench, leaving the courtroom and taking up residence by the fire. A neighbor hears a story once at a threshold and tells it again over porridge, borrowing the turn of phrase that gave it weight, and in the telling the phrase becomes the story's handle, the thing that makes it graspable. Children, eyes wide at the edges of the room, take in the strong nouns, spectre, covenant, torment, and try them aloud as they play, not to deceive but to speak in the grown-up's key, so that childhood talk and adult fear merge in a single dialect. On days appointed for fasting and prayer, when the congregation gathers to humble itself under God's hand, the minister names sins that hide in the heart and admonishes hearers to watch against Satan's wiles, and the terms he uses acquire a kind of borrowed luster. When later repeated in testimony, they carry the gravity of the pulpit. Church discipline, too, with its sober conferences and public confessions, teaches a grammar of self-examination and narration, how to recount inward motions, how to weigh impulses, so that people become practiced in describing invisible urgencies with precise speech. You have heard that, in times to come, a special fast will be kept to bewail the errors of the past year. Even now, in 1693, ordinary fasts remind the town how to speak repentance, how to organize sorrow with words. The prestige of phrases uttered in meeting or court, once attached to speech, travels with it, and the next mouth that uses them sounds more credible for sounding familiar. The turning of policy gives your reading a frame, and you set facts like pegs along the wall to keep the thought from drifting. You note plainly that the governor dissolved the Court of Oyer and Terminer in October 1692, bringing its proceedings to an end, and that a new court, the Superior Court of Judicature, now sits in its place, convened early in this year. Within that chamber, judges grow reluctant to condemn on spectral claims alone, and acquittals increase, a change you see reflected even in the docket notes and endorsements on the backs of writs. It is as if a consensus, slowly, has shifted the threshold of what counts as sure, not to excuse evil, but to keep conjecture from carrying the full weight of law. Reading the depositions again, you begin to suspect that fear can shape testimony sincerely, not as falsehood, but as conviction gently guided by suggestion, repetition, and the weight of communal expectation. You cannot read the heart of the afflicted girl or the anxious midwife whose words sit under your palm. You can only read the marks before you and their likeness to other marks. You make a small prayer there at the desk. Lord, give light from thy word, chasten my understanding, and grant me charity toward erring neighbors, that your judgment may be as cautious as the ink is bold. Back at your bench you sort and bind, and the work teaches you as much as the words themselves teach you. The twine pulls in your fingers, and you hear the faint creak as it tightens around another labeled bundle, a sound like a sigh that the paper makes when it is made orderly. Wax from an old seal flakes beneath your thumbnail, and the brazier sends up a small breath of heat that you catch in the cup of your hands before it slips away. The candle gutters now and then, and each time it does, the shadows on the page make the ink's strokes seem to move, like the traces of thought shifting under fresh conclusion. You find yourself fearing that belief can assemble the very shapes it dreads, not as a fraud, but as a pattern that, once spoken, appears again, and again, until the echo feels like corroboration. So you ask again for discernment. Search me and try me. Keep me from haste. Teach me to judge with mercy. And you remind yourself that your charge is modest. You sought speech. You do not weigh souls. When you write your notes for the archive, you choose careful words, for the pages before you do not only carry facts, they carry the community's grammar of fear, phrases that travel from bench to hearth to bench again, settling into common speech until, when heard in many mouths, they look like proof by the mere fact of their number. You begin with the simplest order, because the simplest order welcomes a tired mind into clarity. You sort the loose packets by the town named at the head of each complaint, then by the month and day inscribed beside the magistrate's hand, stacking Salem village beside Salem town, with Andover, Topsfield, and Gloucester following. You tie each parcel with fresh twine and write on a small tag the case, the place, and the date, leaving room for the clerk's name when the letters rise clean from the page. You draft a brief preface for the whole, a modest account of the paper's condition, some sheets mottled by rain, some smudged where cold fingers pressed too hard, some edges brittle from the brazier's heat in the meetinghouse before you came. You note where corners are gone and sentences vanish mid-stroke, and you mark with a discreet dot those lines where ink has bled into a blot that could be read more than one way. You keep the language spare and serviceable, as if building a small wooden box around something that may yet be needed. You add the administrative particulars, because such particulars will steady a later reader who did not sit with these pages in the winter light. Where a clerk's name is legible, you copy it faithfully. Stephen Sewall for the court transcripts that bear his practised hand, and Samuel Paris and John Higginson in church minutes, where the letters match the sermons you have seen. When a deposition is signed by several deponents, yet the text is in one hand, you say so directly, and give the hand if you can judge it, since that alone may save a magistrate an hour of confusion. You distinguish between warrants and mittimuses that speak of the court of Oyer and Termina, set up and dissolved in the last year, and those that answer to the later superior court of judicature, now sitting under the new charter. You mark the place where a marshal's return is folded into the complaint, and the place where no return is found though a mittimus names a jail, noting in the margin that the record is silent. You refrain from interpreting such absences, and you simply make them plain, for plainness is the only useful courtesy an archive can offer its future. You write the body of your report as you would compose a careful sermon outline, not to persuade, but to keep witness. You state that these pages carry strong conviction and evident distress, that many spoke in fear and sickness, and that magistrates labored under urgency and dread. You record that certain phrases recur from the earliest depositions outward, images of pinching, choking, spectral books, and contracts, moving in a pattern that links houses more closely than any cart path. You add the sentence you have come to believe, without ornament, these are not the voices of witches, but of fear made orderly upon the page, and that words, once uttered, continue in other mouths. You explain that such repetition can teach neighbors how to speak of affliction, and that what sounds like independent corroboration may sometimes be the echo of a lesson learned in trouble. You end not with reproof, but with a practical caution. asking that future courts take great care to separate sameness of phrasing from sameness of cause, and to mark the difference between what is seen with eyes and what is heard and then remembered in the same words. You include a brief note on custody, because the life of a record depends upon its next resting place. You say the bundles will travel under seal to Boston, there to be preserved among the province's papers for ready reference by magistrates and governors when questions return, as they sometimes do. You specify that they are to be joined with church books and town volumes already kept in various chests, registers of baptisms and marriages, lists of admissions to the Lord's table, and accounts of discipline recorded by elders who took care to note both offense and reconciliation. You add that town books carry land bounds, births, and deaths, and that all of these together, though humble, make the outline of a people in the latter part of the 17th century. You ask that future keepers, when binding or copying, preserve docket numbers and clerks' endorsements, because the small marks around a sentence can tell a later reader how the sentence once moved in the world. You sign with your name and date, and you fold the report over twice so that the last page lies quiet and the string keeps its knot. You close the Salem chapter without ceremony, because ordinary days do not love ceremony. You share a plain breakfast of brown bread broken into milk, the steam softening the crust as you spoon it slowly, and you speak a short blessing that asks for peace in houses where voices have been raised. You thank the deacon's wife for her warmth and the steady order of her kitchen, for the tallow candles trimmed each dusk and the basin filled with clean water before sleep. You pack your satchel, tighten the twine around the bundles, and check the wax on the parish letters you have promised to deliver in Boston. You step out into a morning that has turned from iron to lead, the snow darkening in places where the ground begins to drink. You mount and feel the horse settle under you, and you turn once to see the low roofs and straight chimneys of Salem breathing their ordinary smoke into a wind that has softened. You ride south at a measured pace, and the road gives small signs that winter is loosening its hold. Ditches open with a black glimmer, edges furry with old grass, and water makes a quiet music as it slips under the crust toward the marshes. Crows call from the oaks, their shapes stark against branches that hold no leaves, but promise patience, and fields show mottled patches where snow yields to earth the color of bread. The hooves find the sound places between ruts, and the harness creaks as leather warms, a small testimony that use and care keep a body true. You think of how your report may serve, not to judge minds that labored in fear, but to give courts and meeting-houses a calm, written caution when voices rise again in a single shape. You let the thought settle like a folded cloak across your knees, and you travel on with nothing grand in your heart, only the hope that careful words can help a community return to ordinary days, while the road smooths under the thaw and the horse keeps a steady beat. The road south unwinds at an easy pace, and you let it. The hooves keep a gentle measure, a steadying metronome that feels older than quarrels and courts. In the ruts where sleigh runners had scored the earth, clear water gathers and shines, and the fields breathe a faint, thaw-scented promise. Crows lift and settle like bits of ink shaken from a quill. You do not hurry them, or yourself. Whatever is urgent belongs now to the past, bound in twine and set aside. What lingers is quieter, You have handled words until your fingers remembered their weight, words that once trembled and now lie still. There is a grace in that stillness. A page does not raise its voice. It receives whatever is given to it, then waits, patient as winter, for a later hand to turn it. You think of the way a phrase will move from mouth to mouth, from neighbor to neighbor, gathering a shine or losing it, until at last it looks like truth simply because it is familiar. It is a tender thought, and a careful one, that the nearness of a voice can shape a world. The countryside passes by like a psalm sung softly, the same few measures repeated until they do their work. A split rail fence here, a stand of bare birch there, smoke standing straight up from a farmhouse because the air is so calm. With every mile you hold more lightly to certainty and more kindly to hope. Justice, you decide, is not a thunderbolt. It is the slow correction of a hand that steadies the line. Mercy does not erase, it attends. In this wide, wintry light, both seem sensible companions. When Boston's roofs will appear is not important. You will come to the door you left, and you will give the papers to their shelf. They will rest among charters and sermons and deeds, in that deep wooden hush that keeps a city's memory. You will add your thought to the poor, tireless chorus that asks for wisdom, and if your voice is small, it is nonetheless a voice. For now there is only the road and the mild creak of leather and the easy breath of your horse. The air has softened. The sun leans west and grows round and kind. You loosen your shoulders, and the world loosens with you. If fear can travel, so can calm. If error can spread, so can care. You have seen how a sentence survives, and you choose, as you ride, the gentler ones. Evening will come without drama, as it should, and lamps will be lit, and bread will be broken, and nothing strange will appear at the window. You have time enough, you have quiet enough, and the land, washed pale with melt water, seems to be saying what you needed to hear. Rest.